In this lesson, you'll learn how to insert Salesforce users. Why do we create users early on in a data migration process? It's so that we can very easily create a user map. This is how we're going to be able to compare the historical record owner to who the new record owner should be in Salesforce. It'll also help us very easily assign audit field information, such as created by or modified by, based on historical IDs. But before we insert our new file, we want to make sure that we have the legacy ID field created on the user object and mark it as an external ID so that we could access it via upserts later on in the project. Whenever you have a question about what kind of formatting Salesforce is going to be expecting to receive when it gets new information from the data loader, the best way to figure that out is by manually creating a record. So in this case, since we're going to be loading a list of users, what I've done in the past and how I taught myself is I would create a user for each of the different types of parameters. So if I had users in multiple time zones, I'd create one for Pacific, one for Central, one for Eastern, and so on. That way, I could then go do an extract out of the data loader, and then I would see how that information populates into Excel, and then I would know exactly how I need to transform the data to map it in. Luckily, I have found all of the source information and I've put it all into the user workbook that's attached to this lesson. So you'll have a full set of values to work from as far as the email encoding and how to set the time zones and how to set locales and language. All those values are in separate tabs inside of that user workbook. So hopefully you'll be able to skip the step of having to load a handful of users manually, export those, and then try and retrofit your users list into Salesforce. When you prepare a list of users to go in via Data Loader, there are a handful of required fields. And whenever you're coming from another database, you will most likely not have everything that you need because that other database didn't store information about users the same way that Salesforce does. When we go through this step-by-step process, we'll talk about how to populate some of these fields that you may not have seen before and that may not already be captured in your historical data. We'll also go through how you can easily find your role IDs and profile IDs. Because remember, using Data Loader, it doesn't accept text values for records, right? If we want to put a user in with a standard profile, we would need the ID for that profile, not the word standard profile. These IDs, however, are super easy to export out of the data loader into a really nice, easy to use Excel format. So that's what we're going to do in the step-by-step tutorial. A note about the is active checkbox on the user record. So you don't technically have to specify a value in that field. If you don't, the user will automatically be inserted as active. Where this can cause trouble is, let's say that you have 100 users in your historical data, but you only have 50 licenses in Salesforce. So what happens is that you get to user 51 in your list and the file errors out because you've run out of active user licenses. So you can insert as many inactive users as you wish because inactive users are not using a paid active Salesforce license. You can always insert your users as inactive and then activate them later if you're not ready to have active users right away. Another note about creating active users is that you cannot access the field on the user record called generate new password and notify user immediately. It is not accessible to you in the data loader, so you cannot insert a list of users and send that welcome to Salesforce email out concurrently. Let's dive into the step-by-step instructions of inserting new users using Data Loader. Let's take a look at creating a new user manually. When we click the new user button, you can see that certain fields are in red, which means they're required. Last name, alias, email, username, etc. Over here to the right, you can see that there are options available in the user license, which dictates what shows up in the profile. And even though the role says it's required, technically speaking, it's not. So if you don't have roles set up yet, not a big deal. Scrolling down to the locale settings, I want to call attention to the time zone. So the time zone that you see here in the pick list is not the exact same value that corresponds to what you see in the pick list, right? So inside of the user workbook that's attached to this lesson, I've included all of the time zone assignments, as well as the locales, the languages, and the email encoding options. Scrolling back up to the top here, now that we have a better sense of what kind of information is required on a user record, let's take a look at our data and how we can prepare it to go into Salesforce in an insert. So typically, when you're doing any kind of Salesforce data migration, the users are coming from another database. And oftentimes you receive a user file that includes users who are going to be active in Salesforce, as well as historical users who are not going to be active in Salesforce. The first field we want to look at is LegacyId. So like in any data migration, we want to make sure that we have created a LegacyId field on the user object. So let's toggle back into Salesforce. Let's go into our user object, go to our fields, and let's see if we have a LegacyId field. We don't. Let's create one really quickly. We'll go down to text and hit next. We'll call this LegacyId. And you can make this any length. I've not seen IDs longer than 100, but we do want to make it as an external ID. That way, if we ever wanted to upsert against this value on the user object, we can do so very easily. Now that we have our LegacyId field, let's go back to our data. Typically coming from another database, you will not have an alias coming from the other database. Now in the user workbook, the very first tab that you see is called template. So I put a couple of items in here, namely the fact that the alias has an 8-character limit. So I recommend taking the first name of the person or the first initial of the first name and then the last name of the person or the first 7 characters of it to make an 8-character alias. So when you load it in, Salesforce won't kick it back. The email address can be used across multiple orgs, but the username has to be in the format of an email and cannot be used in more than one Salesforce org. When I ultimately give you this test data to load into your own org, I have a website that I'm going to share with you that teaches you how to pull some essentially fake email addresses that you can use as usernames. Again, username just has to be in the format of an email, but it cannot be used in more than one Salesforce org. So obviously, if I use this data here, you can't use it in an org of your own choosing. The next field is email encoding. So down here at the bottom of our template, we have a tab called email encoding. So should you need a different email encoding, you can see all of the accepted values there, along with accepted values for language, locale, currency settings, and time zones. Notice this looks significantly different from what you saw in the pick list. Let's go back to our Test Data Prepped tab. We've established the email encoding, the first name, and now we have the is active. If you do mark a user as active, it does not automatically send the new user email. There's nothing that you can do from a data load, like from an insert, that allows you to also kick out that email at the same time as you're creating a new user record. Toggling over here, we've got our language set, last name, locale. This full name field isn't needed, but it is sometimes you receive a full name from the other database and you have to separate it into first and last. You'll notice, however, that the profile ID and the user role ID columns are blank. We do need to have a profile ID in order to insert these records. We don't have to have a user role ID, but as far as this being a tutorial, I think it'll be helpful if we go ahead and do that. So if we go back into Salesforce, if we click on the Home tab, if we wanted to go find those profile IDs manually, we can search from the Home tab for profiles. And let's say we wanted to make a couple of users system administrators. If we click on the system administrator, we can then see up here after the letter F, this would be the profile ID. You could technically make your own key going into the profiles that are necessary for your load and adding those in. You could also just choose one and assign everybody the same profile and go back later and update it. But we don't want to do that. We're going to do it the right way the first time. Let's also take a look at our roles. So if I search for roles and I go into our role hierarchy, I can see that we have a series of roles set up for Sales Manager East and Sales Rep East, and then same for the West. If I click into Sales Manager East and I go up here to my URL, I can see that this 00E, that is my ID for that role. And again, I could make a key for this, but that's an awful lot of work and there's a possibility I could make a mistake. So here's what I'm going to do to shortcut. I'm going to go into my data loader. I'm logged into my org. I'm going to go to export. And the first thing I'm going to export are my profiles. I start typing profiles, but nothing shows up. So I click Show All Salesforce Objects. And now I'm able to see my profiles. So let's scroll down here to Profile. I'm going to name this Profile Extract. And to make sure that I stay in line with my best practices, I am going to go into my workbooks, create a new folder called Profiles, click Next, select all of my fields, and hit Finish. I have 42 successful extractions. Now I'm going to do the same thing for roles. I start typing role. I don't see the object I need, so I click Show All. And then I will click on role where it says user role. I'll name this role extract. And again, I'm going to create a new folder so I know exactly where I put these. I'll select all of my fields and hit finish. And I've got 6 successful extractions. Now let's go into these new folders. Let's go into profiles and open up the extract file that we built. Inside of our file, we care about the ID and we care about the name. So I'm going to put the name to the left of the ID so I could very easily do a VLOOKUP. Over in my prepped data file, most of the time the client's going to give you some sense of what kind of profile permissions that the user needs. It may not be exactly what you would call them, but it's enough information so that you could say, I know that I need to assign these 4 people the advisor profile, and then I need a couple of people to be personal bankers, and then I need 1 or 2 people to be system admins, right? So assuming that you have that language set up already in here, like profile name that you want to assign, then you can use a VLOOKUP in Excel to pull in that profile ID. So what would that look like? So let's say that we have profile name and we want this person to be advisor. And let's say that we want these to be advisor and maybe we want these to be system administrators. And maybe we had another one. So now what we can do is we will create, let me pull this file over here. Make this a little smaller. Now we're going to use a VLOOKUP. We're going to say, hey, go find advisor in this other file and bring back the ID corresponding to it in the next column over. On this, we're going to double click and drop this down. Okay, so now we can see we've got 4 profiles with the 9U AAC and then these profile IDs for the 9V AAC. Excellent. Now we know our profile IDs. Then we can go through and use the same concept for our user role. So let's say that we have role name, and again, we're not going to map this in our file, but we would use it in order to bring in the assigned role ID. So let's say that I go into my role extract, and then I follow the same set of steps, right? If I have my ID here in green, I'm going to bring my name to the left of it. And I know that I want, let's just say, to make our lives easier on a training call, let's do this, this. Okay? So now we are going to do another VLOOKUP. We're going to go find Sales Manager East and bring in the ID related to it. Double click that down. Then we're going to copy and paste our values to remove that formula. And now we have our assigned user role IDs. Over in our username, again, you can see these are all fake. I added a 44 to them just to make sure I haven't used them in another org. But we have all of the fields that we need now to load our data. So we're going to copy this and create a new CSV file. And we will save this and call it users prepped. And we do want it in our user folder, which is where we are already at. All right, now the only question is, since I created the LegacyId field, it may not be accessible in here right away. So why don't we click on Insert, go to our user object, and we're going to go into our users file and grab our prepped file. We're clicking Next, it's thinking through. And then we are going to go to create or edit our map. Let's see what we got here. Did everything map over? Yep, LegacyId was there. Cool. So we will click Next. And then we are going to make sure that we put this output into the users folder again. Hit Finish. And here we have our 10 successful users inserted. Now we'll go into our success file, rename it user success. Then we're going to open it, grab all of this data, and we're going to create a new tab in our user workbook, and we'll call this our successes, right? Now, whenever we need to do any type of data loading, we can very easily use VLOOKUPs because we have our LegacyId next to the Salesforce generated user ID, right? Always starts in 005. We can also do upserts on that ID whenever we have scenarios where we want to be able to reference the historical user ID coming from the other database and cross-reference with a Salesforce user ID associated to it. Okay, now it's your turn. Now that you have seen how to insert a list of new Salesforce users using the data loader, you can open the user workbook attached to this lesson because it includes some test data that you can load into your developer org to get some practice. A reminder is that the usernames have to be in the format of an email, but they're like social security numbers in that they have to be unique across all Salesforce orgs. So if you use the data that I've given you, as far as just those usernames, then you'll see an error because they've already been used. Use the link in this lesson to go to the online data generator to get some fake emails or add just some additional characters into the username emails that I've given you in the test data. I want you to note this website where you can then go in and specify how many emails that you want, and it'll give those to you. And then you can paste those into your prepped data file so you know that you can load that information into Salesforce and not get any errors. See you in the next lesson.